The cardboard sign read, "Math Tutoring Free," in Marcus Rivera's careful handwriting, propped against the concrete pillar where he'd made his temporary classroom. Under the flickering fluorescent lights of the subway underpass, 8 children sat cross-legged on flattened boxes, their faces illuminated by the warm glow of battery-powered lanterns as they worked through algebra problems with an intensity that defied their circumstances. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Marcus had been living on the streets of Metro City for 3 years, ever since the budget cuts eliminated his position at Riverside High School. The irony wasn't lost on him that the same economic forces that had stripped funding from public education had also made him homeless. But he refused to let bitterness consume the passion that had driven him to become a teacher in the first place. Every evening at 6 sharp, he would set up his makeshift classroom in the underpass, welcoming any child who wanted to learn. The kids who found their way to Marcus came from the forgotten corners of the city. Some lived in shelters with overwhelmed parents working multiple jobs. Others had aged out of foster care with nowhere to go, and a few, like 12-year-old Sofia Castellanos, lived in the shadows completely on their own. Sofia had appeared 3 months ago, a slight girl with intelligent dark eyes and clothes that hung loose on her small frame. She never spoke about where she slept or how she survived, but she never missed a single tutoring session. Tonight, Sofia was struggling with quadratic equations, her brow furrowed in concentration as she erased and rewrote the same problem for the 4th time. Marcus knelt beside her on the cold concrete, his voice gentle and encouraging as he guided her through the steps. He had learned not to ask too many questions about his students. Lives outside these underground walls. Their presence here was enough. "Mr. Marcus?" Sofia said quietly, using the respectful title all the children had adopted. "Why do you do this? Why do you teach us when nobody pays you?" Her question carried the weight of someone who had learned too young that nothing in life came without a price. Marcus paused, looking around at the faces of his students. There was Jerome, 13 and fiercely protective of his younger sister Maya, who sat beside him solving fractions. There was Carmen, 15 and pregnant, determined to finish high school despite everything working against her. There was little David, only 8, but already reading at a high school level, hungry for knowledge that his underfunded elementary school couldn't provide. "Because every one of you deserves a chance," Marcus said simply. "Because education isn't a privilege for the wealthy. It's a right that belongs to every child, regardless of where they sleep at night or what their address is." He had given this same answer countless times to social workers, police officers, and curious passers-by who questioned his motives. Some suspected he was running some kind of scam. Others worried about a grown man spending time with vulnerable children. But Marcus had undergone background checks and earned the trust of the local community center director who vouched for his character. Sofia nodded solemnly, then returned to her equations with renewed focus. She had an extraordinary mind, Marcus had realized early on. While other students struggled with basic concepts, Sofia grasped complex mathematical principles with an intuition that reminded him of the gifted students he'd taught in his former life. She devoured every book he could find for her, borrowing volumes from the public library on his card and returning them promptly, their pages carefully preserved despite her harsh living conditions. What Marcus didn't know was that Sofia Castellanos was not actually homeless by circumstance, but by choice. She was the niece of Victoria Castellanos Chen, the formidable CEO of Global Educational Dynamics, the world's largest private education corporation. GED controlled standardized testing in 43 countries, owned networks of elite private schools, and held contracts worth billions of dollars with governments seeking to privatize their education systems. 3 months ago, Sofia had run away from her aunt's penthouse apartment after overhearing a conversation that shattered her understanding of the woman who had raised her since her parents' death in a car accident when she was 7. Victoria had been on a conference call with her board of directors, discussing their latest acquisition of struggling public schools in urban districts. The plan was always the same: purchase the schools for pennies on the dollar, fire the existing teachers, implement standardized curricula that required expensive GED materials, and extract maximum profit while providing minimal education. "The beauty of poverty," Victoria had said with cold calculation, "is that desperate parents will accept any alternative we offer them, no matter how inadequate. These people don't know quality education when they see it. They're just grateful their children aren't on the streets. Sofia had listened in horror as her aunt described children like herself as market opportunities, their desperation as leverage for profit. The woman who had given her every material advantage, who had enrolled her in the most exclusive preparatory academy in the city, who had spoken passionately about the importance of education at countless family dinners, was systematically destroying educational opportunities for children who couldn't afford better. That night, Sofia had packed a small backpack with essential clothes, taken $200 from the household emergency fund, and disappeared into the sprawling metropolis. She had been living in abandoned buildings, eating from food banks and soup kitchens, surviving on the streets to understand the reality faced by the children her aunt's company exploited. Finding Marcus's underground classroom had been a revelation. Here was everything Victoria claimed to value about education, delivered with genuine passion and care to the students who needed it most. Marcus taught not because he was paid handsomely, not because it enhanced his social status, not because it would advance his career, but because he believed deeply in the transformative power of knowledge. As the weeks passed, Sofia found herself looking forward to the evening sessions with an anticipation that surprised her. In her former life of privilege, education had been a series of obligations to fulfill, grades to achieve, and competitions to win. Here in the underpass, learning was a gift freely given and gratefully received. She watched Marcus spend his own meager resources on supplies, saw him shiver in the cold while ensuring his students stayed warm, witnessed his genuine celebration when one of them grasped a difficult concept. Marcus had no idea that the quiet, brilliant girl who never missed a lesson was connected to the very forces that had destroyed his career. Sofia Castellanos Chen's company had been instrumental in the budget cuts that eliminated his position at Riverside High. GED had lobbied extensively for policies that defunded public schools, arguing that private alternatives could provide better education more efficiently. When Riverside lost its funding, GED had immediately moved in with an offer to purchase the building and convert it into a charter school with reduced teacher salaries and increased class sizes. The cruel irony was that Marcus had been an exceptional teacher precisely because he embodied everything GED claimed to support but actually undermined. He had consistently achieved remarkable results with disadvantaged students, turning around test scores in one of the district's most challenging schools. His classroom had been a sanctuary where struggling kids found academic success and personal growth, but none of that mattered when corporate interests aligned with political expediency to eliminate his position. Now 3 years later, Marcus continued teaching with the same dedication that had made. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. And legendary among his former students. Many of them still kept in touch, sending him photos from college graduations and job promotions, crediting him with changing the trajectory of their lives. But without a permanent address or stable income, he couldn't pursue the certification renewals and continuing education credits required to return to formal teaching. Sofia began arriving earlier each evening, helping Marcus set up the lanterns and arrange the seating. She had started bringing supplies she claimed to find in dumpsters behind office buildings, never mentioning that she was actually purchasing them with careful portions of her remaining money. Notebooks, pencils, erasers, and occasionally scientific calculators that she said had been discarded by students at nearby private schools. "You have a real gift for this," Marcus told her one evening as she explained a geometry concept to David, breaking it down into terms the 8-year-old could understand. "Have you ever thought about becoming a teacher yourself?" Sofia's face clouded briefly. In her former life, she had planned to study business and eventually join her aunt's company, believing it to be a force for educational progress. Now the thought of corporate involvement in education made her sick. "I think I'd like to help kids like us," she said carefully. "Kids who don't have a lot of advantages." Marcus smiled warmly. "The best teachers are often those who understand struggle firsthand. You'd make an incredible educator someday." He had no way of knowing that Sofia had access to the finest educational opportunities money could buy, that she was currently enrolled, though absent, from one of the most exclusive preparatory academies in the nation. As autumn deepened into winter, the conditions in the underpass became increasingly harsh. The city's homeless population swelled as temperatures dropped, and the subway authorities began conducting more frequent sweeps to move people along. Marcus worried constantly about his students' safety and welfare, particularly Sofia, who seemed more fragile than the others despite her sharp intellect. One particularly bitter evening in December, only 4 students showed up for the session. Marcus had been battling a persistent cough for weeks, and his voice was barely above a whisper as he worked through chemistry problems with Jerome and Maya. Sofia noticed his labored breathing and the way his hands shook as he wrote equations on their makeshift whiteboard. "Mr. Marcus, you're sick," she said with the directness that Marcus had come to appreciate about her. "You need medicine, and you need to be somewhere warm." Marcus waved dismissively. "I'm fine, just a little cold. Nothing that won't clear up." But even as he spoke, a violent coughing fit seized him, leaving him gasping and pale. Sofia made a decision that would change everything. The next morning, she used the last of her money to purchase a prepaid cell phone and called the one person she had sworn never to contact again. Sofia Castellanos Chen answered on the second ring, her voice sharp with worry and barely contained fury. "Sofia Elena Castellanos, where the hell have you been? Do you have any idea what you've put me through? I've had private investigators combing the city for 3 months. I've been worried sick." "I'm fine, Aunt Victoria," Sofia said quietly, "but I need your help." The line was silent for a long moment. Then Victoria's voice returned, softer but still strained. "Where are you? I'll send a car immediately. We'll talk about everything when you get home." "I'm not coming home," Sofia said firmly. "Not yet. But there's someone who needs help. Someone important. A teacher who's been helping kids like me." Victoria's tone shifted to the cold professionalism Sofia remembered from business calls. "I don't know what kind of situation you've gotten yourself involved in, but I'm not funding whatever scheme some street person is running on you." "He's not running a scheme," Sofia said, her voice rising with anger. "He's a real teacher who lost his job because of companies like yours. He's been tutoring homeless kids for free, using his own money for supplies, sleeping in the cold so kids can learn, and now he's sick, and he needs medical care." There was another long silence. When Victoria spoke again, her voice was carefully controlled. "Where are you? I need to see the situation for myself." That evening, a black sedan pulled up near the subway entrance at precisely 6 o'clock. Sofia Castellanos Chen emerged wearing a tailored wool coat and leather gloves, her expression unreadable as she descended into the underpass. She had expected to find some sort of con artist taking advantage of her naive niece's good intentions. What she found instead stopped her cold. Marcus was seated on a folded blanket, his back against the concrete wall, speaking in his hoarse whisper to a circle of children hanging on his every word. Despite his obvious illness, his eyes were bright with passion as he explained the principles of photosynthesis using simple drawings on a piece of cardboard. The children were completely engaged, asking thoughtful questions and building on each other's observations. Victoria recognized real teaching when she saw it. In her years running GED, she had visited hundreds of classrooms and observed thousands of educators. Most were competent, some were exceptional, but very few possessed the rare combination of subject mastery, pedagogical skill, and genuine care that transformed struggling students into lifelong learners. Marcus Rivera had that gift in abundance. Sofia spotted her aunt and approached cautiously. "Thank you for coming," she said quietly. "I know you think I'm being foolish, but please just watch for a few minutes." Victoria found herself drawn into the lesson despite her skepticism. Marcus was teaching advanced concepts, using everyday analogies that made complex ideas accessible. When one of the younger children struggled with a particular point, an older student immediately offered to help, creating the kind of peer-to-peer learning environment that educational researchers praised but rarely achieved. "How long has he been doing this?" Victoria asked Sofia in a whisper. "Every night for the past 3 years," Sofia replied. "Rain or shine, winter or summer. These kids come here because they want to learn, and he teaches them because he believes they deserve a chance." Victoria watched as Marcus patiently worked with a teenage girl on algebra problems, never showing frustration when she needed concepts explained multiple times. She observed the respect and affection in the children's eyes when they looked at their teacher, the way they listened intently to his quiet words. the pride they took in showing him their completed work. When the session ended at 8 o'clock, Marcus began his usual routine of cleaning up the space and ensuring each child had a safe place to go for the night. It was then that Victoria stepped forward. "Mr. Rivera," she said, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "I'm Victoria Castellanos Chen. I believe you've been teaching my niece." Marcus looked from Victoria to Sofia, confusion clear on his face. Sofia had never mentioned having family, let alone family wealthy enough to afford such expensive clothing. "Your niece?" he asked hoarsely. "Sofia," Victoria said simply. "She's been living on the streets for 3 months. I've been looking for her." Her tone was neutral, revealing nothing of the complex emotions churning beneath her controlled exterior. Marcus stared at Sofia in shock. "You have family? You have a home?" The betrayal in his voice was unmistakable. He had worried about her safety every night, had shared his meager resources with her, had assumed she was as desperate and abandoned as his other students. "It's complicated," Sofia said, tears beginning to form in her eyes. "I couldn't stay there anymore, not after I learned what she does." Victoria's jaw tightened. "What I do is provide educational opportunities to millions of children worldwide. What I do is build schools and create jobs and improve test scores in failing districts. What you do is destroy schools like the one Mr. Marcus worked at." Sofia shot back. "What you do is fire good teachers and replace them with cheap alternatives. What you do is turn education into a business where poor kids get a worse education so rich shareholders can get richer." The accusation hung in the cold air between them. Marcus looked from Sofia to Victoria, pieces of a puzzle beginning to form in his mind. "Castellanos Chen," he repeated slowly. "Global Educational Dynamics." Victoria nodded stiffly. "I'm the CEO." Marcus felt the world tilt beneath him. The company that had lobbied for the policies that destroyed his career was run by the aunt of his most dedicated student. The irony was so profound it nearly made him laugh, but another coughing fit seized him instead, leaving him gasping against the concrete wall. "You need medical attention," Victoria said briskly, her business instincts taking over. "I'm calling an ambulance." "I can't afford an ambulance," Marcus said weakly. "I can't afford a hospital." "I can," Victoria replied, already dialing on her phone. As she gave instructions to the emergency operator, she found herself studying the makeshift classroom more carefully. The organization was impressive, the teaching materials were thoughtfully selected, and the evidence of real learning was everywhere she looked. When the paramedics arrived, they insisted that Marcus's condition required immediate hospitalization. As they prepared to transport him, he looked desperately at his students, who had gathered around with worried faces. "The sessions," he said weakly. "Tomorrow night. I won't be here." "We'll figure something out," Sofia said firmly, taking his hand. "Just focus on getting better." As the ambulance pulled away, Victoria found herself alone in the underpass, with 8 children ranging in age from 8 to 15, all looking at her with varying degrees of suspicion and hope. They clearly expected her to abandon them now that their teacher was gone. Instead, Victoria found herself asking, "What were you supposed to study tomorrow?" The next 3 weeks changed everything. Victoria had checked Marcus into the city's best private hospital, where doctors treated his pneumonia and addressed several other health issues related to his years of inadequate nutrition and exposure. Meanwhile, she found herself returning to the underpass each evening, initially just to ensure the children weren't being taken advantage of by anyone else. What started as protective supervision gradually became something else entirely. Victoria discovered that she remembered more from her own educational background than she had realized. Her MBA had required extensive mathematics, her business experience had given her practical applications for abstract concepts, and her years of evaluating curricula had taught her to identify effective teaching methods. More importantly, she began to see her students as individuals rather than market demographics. Jerome was brilliant but struggled with reading due to an undiagnosed learning disability. Maya had an extraordinary aptitude for science but had never had access to proper laboratory experiences. Carmen was determined to finish her education despite her pregnancy, but needed support and encouragement rather than judgment. David was gifted beyond his years, but required intellectual challenges that his regular school couldn't provide. Sofia watched her aunt's transformation with amazement and growing hope. The cold, calculating executive who had spoken of poverty as a business opportunity was revealing glimpses of the woman who had once chosen education as her field, who had started GED with genuine intentions to improve schools before profit margins and shareholder pressure had corrupted her mission. "You're good at this," Sofia told her aunt one evening after a particularly successful lesson on environmental science. "The kids are really learning." Victoria looked around at the eager faces of her students, many of whom had initially regarded her with suspicion but were now raising their hands enthusiastically to answer questions. "It's been a long time since I actually taught," she admitted. "I'd forgotten how rewarding it could be." "Why did you stop?" Sofia asked. It was the first personal conversation they'd had since her return. Victoria was quiet for a long moment, organizing notebooks and papers as she considered her answer. "I started GED because I wanted to help schools that were failing their students. I thought private enterprise could provide solutions that bureaucratic public systems couldn't. But somewhere along the way, the mission got lost in the numbers. Profit margins, efficiency metrics, quarterly reports. I stopped seeing students and started seeing revenue streams." Sofia nodded, understanding more than her aunt realized. "Mr. Marcus says that's the danger of treating education like a business. He says learning can't be measured just by test scores and profit margins." "Mr. Marcus is right," Victoria said quietly. "I've spent years telling myself that improving test scores justified everything else. But test scores don't measure creativity or critical thinking or the confidence to ask difficult questions. They don't measure the joy a child feels when they finally understand a concept they've been struggling with." When Marcus was finally released from the hospital 3 weeks later, he was stunned to find Victoria still teaching in the underpass. The children greeted him with enthusiasm, eagerly showing him the work they had completed in his absence. Sofia had coordinated everything, ensuring continuity in their lessons while also helping her aunt understand the specific needs and learning styles of each student. "I don't understand," Marcus said to Victoria as the evening session concluded. "Why are you here? What do you want?" Victoria took a deep breath, knowing that her next words would determine whether the fragile progress of the past weeks would continue or crumble. "I want to make things right," she said simply. "I want to do what I should have been doing all along." Marcus studied her face, looking for signs of deception or manipulation. He found none, only exhaustion and what appeared to be genuine remorse. "What does that mean exactly?" "It means I want to hire you," Victoria said. "Not for GED. For something new. Something better. I want to create schools that actually serve the kids who need them most. Real schools with real teachers who care about learning rather than test scores. I want to prove that education can be both excellent and accessible." Marcus shook his head. "I've heard these promises before. Politicians, administrators, corporate executives. They all say they want to help disadvantaged kids. And they cut budgets and fire teachers and implement programs designed to fail so they can be replaced with something cheaper." "I know," Victoria said. "I've been one of those executives. But working with these kids, teaching them, seeing what real education looks like when it's driven by passion instead of profit, it's reminded me why I went into education in the first place." Sofia stepped forward, looking between her aunt and her teacher. "She's different," she said to Marcus. "I've watched her for 3 weeks. She's not the same person who built GED into what it became. She's remembered who she used to be." Marcus remained skeptical. "Even if that's true, what about global educational dynamics? What about all the schools you've damaged? All the teachers you've displaced?" Victoria's face hardened with determination. "I'm going to change GED from the inside. I'm going to redirect the company toward actual educational excellence, instead of profit maximization. And if the board fights me, if the shareholders resist, then I'll walk away and start something new. Something that puts students first." The transformation didn't happen overnight. Victoria faced enormous resistance from her board of directors when she announced plans to restructure GED's business model. Several major investors threatened to pull their funding if she proceeded with what they called financially irresponsible idealism. The stock price fluctuated wildly as Wall Street analysts tried to understand whether Victoria's new direction represented a brilliant long-term strategy or a temporary breakdown in judgment. But Victoria persevered, using her considerable personal wealth and influence to maintain control of the company while implementing sweeping changes. She began by rehiring teachers who had been laid off during previous cost-cutting measures, starting with Marcus Rivera, whom she appointed as Director of Educational Innovation, with a mandate to develop teaching methods that prioritized learning over testing. The underground classroom continued to meet 3 evenings a week, even as Victoria worked to secure permanent housing and educational support for each of the students. Jerome received tutoring for his learning disability and was eventually accepted to a prestigious high school with a strong special education program. Maya was enrolled in a STEM academy where her scientific interests could flourish. Carmen received support throughout her pregnancy and was able to complete her high school education while learning valuable parenting skills. Sofia made the decision to remain with her aunt, but only after Victoria agreed to involve her in every aspect of GED's transformation. At 15, Sofia became the youngest advisor in the company's history, providing insight into student perspectives and ensuring that policy changes actually benefited the children they were designed to serve. The new GED faced significant challenges. Competitors accused Victoria of abandoning sound business practices. Political opponents criticized her for undermining charter school initiatives that had become popular with conservative voters. Former allies in the education privatization movement felt betrayed by what they saw as her sudden conversion to progressive idealism. But the results spoke for themselves. Schools operating under GED's new model showed dramatic improvements not just in test scores but in student engagement, teacher retention, and community satisfaction. Parents who had previously felt powerless in their children's education became active participants in school governance. Teachers who had been demoralized by standardized curriculum requirements rediscovered their passion for creative instruction. Marcus found himself at the center of an educational revolution that he had never imagined possible. His teaching methods, developed through years of working with the most challenging students under the most difficult conditions, became the foundation for training programs that transformed classrooms across the country. The underground lessons that had once served 8 homeless children were now being adapted for thousands of students in dozens of schools. 2 years after their first meeting in the subway underpass, Marcus and Victoria stood together at the grand opening of the first Marcus Rivera Academy for Innovative Learning, a state-of-the-art school built in the heart of the district where Marcus had once taught. The building featured flexible classroom spaces, advanced technology, extensive arts programs, and comprehensive support services for students and families. Sofia, now 17 and preparing for college, served as the student speaker at the opening ceremony. She spoke about the importance of teachers who saw potential in every student, about the power of education to transform lives, and about the responsibility of those with privilege to ensure that opportunity was available to all children regardless of their circumstances. 3 years ago, I was a privileged kid who thought I understood education because I attended an expensive school, Sofia told the assembled crowd of educators, politicians, and community members. But I learned more in a subway tunnel from a homeless teacher than I had in years of elite classrooms. I learned that real education isn't about impressive buildings or expensive technology. It's about teachers who care, students who are hungry to learn, and communities that believe every child deserves a chance to succeed. As applause filled the auditorium, Marcus reflected on the unlikely journey that had brought them all to this moment. The man who had lost everything because of corporate greed had found purpose in teaching society's most forgotten children. The executive who had built an empire on educational inequality had rediscovered her moral compass through the eyes of her runaway niece. The runaway who had sought to understand poverty had instead taught her family the true meaning of wealth. The story could have ended there, with the triumphant opening of a new school and the successful transformation of a major corporation. But real change, Marcus knew, was measured not in dramatic moments, but in daily choices, in the patient work of education that happened one student at a time. Every morning, as he walked through the halls of the academy that bore his name, Marcus remembered the children who had gathered around him in the cold underpass, hungry for knowledge and hope. Some of them were now students at the academy, others had moved on to different schools, but all carried with them the lesson that learning was a gift to be treasured rather than a burden to be endured. Victoria continued to face challenges in her role as CEO of the transformed GED. Quarterly earnings reports sometimes disappointed investors who preferred the higher profit margins of the old model. Political pressure mounted from those who saw her company's success as a threat to their own educational agendas. But every evening, when she reviewed the academic progress reports from GED schools, she was reminded of why the struggle was worthwhile. Sofia thrived in college, majoring in education policy with a focus on serving disadvantaged populations. She spent her summers working in GED schools, often teaching in the same style that Marcus had pioneered in the underground classroom. Her experiences on the streets had given her insights into student needs that no textbook could provide, while her privileged background had taught her how to navigate systems of power and influence. The subway underpass, where everything had begun, was eventually converted into a community learning center, with Marcus's original cardboard sign preserved under glass as a reminder that education could happen anywhere when it was driven by passion and purpose. The center offered tutoring, adult education classes, and job training programs, serving hundreds of families each month. On quiet evenings when the center was closed and the tunnels were empty except for the rumble of passing trains, Marcus sometimes returned to the spot where he had first taught Sofia quadratic equations. He would stand in the fluorescent light, remembering the faces of children who had believed in the power of learning despite every reason to give up hope. The transformation of GED became a case study in business schools and education programs across the country. Victoria was invited to speak at conferences about corporate responsibility and the ethics of educational privatization. Her story resonated with audiences who had assumed that profit and purpose were incompatible in the education sector. But for Marcus, Victoria, and Sofia, the real measure of their success was much simpler. It was Jerome's acceptance to college despite his learning disability. It was Maya's scholarship to study environmental science. It was Carmen's graduation with her toddler daughter in the audience. It was David's entry into a gifted program that would nurture his exceptional abilities. It was the knowledge that somewhere in the city, in schools that bore no resemblance to corporate boardrooms or exclusive academies, children were discovering the joy of learning from teachers who saw potential in every student. It was the understanding that education, at its best, was not about producing workers or consumers or test scores, but about nurturing human beings capable of critical thinking, creative expression, and compassionate action. As the years passed, the story of the homeless teacher and the CEO became legend in educational circles. But those who knew them personally understood that their real achievement was not the dramatic transformation of a major corporation or the opening of innovative schools. Their real achievement was the daily choice to see education as a sacred trust, to treat every student as worthy of their best efforts, and to remember that learning was not a commodity to be sold but a gift to be shared. In the end, the subway underpass had taught them all the same lesson that Marcus had been trying to share with his students from the beginning. That knowledge belonged to everyone, that wisdom could be found in the most unlikely places, and that the true measure of education was not what students could memorize for tests, but what they carried with them into the world as citizens, parents, and human beings, committed to making life better for those who would come after them. The boardroom on the 52nd floor of the Global Educational Dynamics headquarters had witnessed countless strategic discussions, but nothing quite like the tension that filled the mahogany-paneled space on this crisp October morning. Victoria Castellanos Chen sat at the head of the gleaming conference table, her expression carefully controlled as she faced 12 of the most powerful figures in private education. Their faces ranged from confused to openly hostile as they processed the proposal she had just presented. Robert Thornfield, the silver-haired chairman of the board and GED's largest shareholder, leaned back in his leather chair with the calculated disdain of a man accustomed to crushing opposition. "Victoria, I've known you for 8 years. I've watched you build this company into the most profitable education enterprise in the world. So I have to ask, with all due respect, have you completely lost your mind?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Victoria had anticipated this reaction, had spent weeks preparing for this moment, but hearing her own board question, her sanity still stung. Around the table, other members shifted uncomfortably, their loyalty divided between personal relationships and fiduciary responsibility. "The numbers don't lie, Robert." Victoria replied evenly, activating the wall-mounted display that showed a comprehensive financial analysis. "Yes, our profit margins will decrease in the short term, but long-term sustainability requires adapting to changing market conditions. Public opinion is turning against education privatization. Political winds are shifting. We can either evolve now, or wait for government regulation to force our hand. Margaret Chen, the board's lead financial analyst and no relation despite the shared surname, stood to examine the projections more closely. Her reputation for brutal honesty had made her both feared and respected in corporate circles. These numbers assume that increased spending on teacher salaries and facility improvements will somehow generate equivalent returns through improved outcomes and community satisfaction. That's a very optimistic scenario, Victoria. What if it doesn't work? Victoria clicked to the next slide, showing preliminary data from the 3 pilot schools that had already begun implementing the new model. It is working, Margaret. Test scores are up 12% across all demographics. Teacher retention has improved by 47%. Parent satisfaction ratings have increased from 62% to 91%. Most importantly, our community approval ratings have jumped from 34% to 78%. The data was impressive, but Victoria could see skepticism in the eyes around the table. These were people who had built fortunes by viewing education as a business, rather than a calling. The idea of voluntarily reducing profits to improve outcomes for low-income students challenged everything they believed about market dynamics. James Rodriguez, a former state education secretary who had joined the board after helping GED secure several lucrative government contracts, spoke with the careful precision of a politician weighing his words. Victoria, I understand your passion for educational excellence. We all share that commitment. But we also have responsibilities to our shareholders, our employees, and our stakeholders. This proposal essentially asks us to give away millions of dollars in proven revenue based on idealistic theories about what education should be. It's not idealism, James, Victoria said firmly. It's sustainability. The current model is unsustainable both ethically and financially. We're facing increased scrutiny from federal investigators, mounting criticism from education advocacy groups, and growing resistance from communities that feel exploited by our practices. We can continue on the current path and face inevitable backlash, or we can lead the industry toward a more responsible approach. Robert Thornfield's laugh was cold and calculated. Responsible to whom? We have a responsibility to maximize shareholder value. That's not just good business, it's a legal obligation. You're asking us to abandon our fiduciary duty based on sentimental attachments to a handful of students and teachers. The words hit Victoria like a physical blow. She thought of Marcus, still recovering from months of illness and malnutrition, whose brilliance had been wasted because corporate policies had eliminated his position. She thought of Sofia, who had been willing to live on the streets rather than remain complicit in a system that exploited vulnerable children. She thought of Jerome, Maya, Carmen, David, and the dozens of other students whose potential was being squandered by schools that prioritized profits over learning. Those handful of students and teachers represent millions of children across this country who deserve better than what we're currently providing, Victoria said, her voice rising with passion. We have a responsibility that goes beyond shareholder returns. We have a responsibility to the communities we serve, to the profession we claim to support, and to the future we're helping to shape through the education we provide. The room fell silent. Victoria could hear the muffled sounds of city traffic 40 floors below, the quiet hum of the building's climate control system, the soft breathing of 12 people who held the power to either support her vision or destroy everything she was trying to build. Sarah Mitchell, the youngest board member and a former investment banker who had specialized in education sector acquisitions, finally spoke. Victoria, I respect what you're trying to accomplish, but I have to ask the question that everyone here is thinking. What happened to you? 6 months ago, you were the most ruthless advocate for efficiency and profit maximization in this industry. You eliminated entire departments to improve our quarterly numbers. You personally approved the layoffs that reduced our teaching staff by 30% while increasing class sizes. Now you're asking us to reverse all of those decisions and more. What changed? Victoria had known this question would come, had rehearsed various answers, but none of them captured the complete truth of her transformation. How could she explain that watching a homeless man teach algebra to street children had reminded her of why she had entered education in the first place? How could she describe the shame she felt when she realized that her own niece had chosen homelessness rather than complicity in the destruction of public education? I remembered why I started this company, Victoria said simply. I started GED because I believed private enterprise could provide better educational opportunities than failing public systems. Somewhere along the way, I lost sight of that mission. I became so focused on competing with other companies, on impressing investors, on meeting quarterly projections, that I forgot the actual purpose of education. Robert Thornfield's expression hardened. The purpose of this company is to generate returns for our investors while providing educational services to our clients. That's what we've done successfully for 8 years. That's what our shareholders expect us to continue doing. Our shareholders also expect us to operate with integrity and social responsibility. Victoria countered. They expect us to build a company that will be profitable and respected for decades to come. The current model is already generating negative publicity and regulatory attention. How long do you think we can maintain our current profit margins if federal investigators find evidence of deliberate educational neglect? How long before state legislatures begin passing laws specifically designed to limit our operations? Margaret Chen had been studying financial projections on her tablet throughout the conversation. She looked up with the expression of someone who had discovered an unpleasant surprise. Victoria, these numbers assume that our competitors will not adapt their own strategies in response to our changes. What happens if Pinnacle Educational Solutions or Academic Excellence Corporation decide to undercut our bids by maintaining lower standards and cheaper operations? We could lose market share while spending more on improvements that our clients may not value enough to pay premium prices for. The question highlighted the central dilemma of Victoria's proposal. The education industry had become so focused on cost reduction and efficiency metrics that genuine improvements in teaching and learning were often viewed as unnecessary expenses. Parents and communities desperate for alternatives to failing public schools were often willing to accept lower quality education as long as it appeared to offer hope for their children's futures. That's exactly why we need to change the conversation, Victoria said. Instead of competing on price and efficiency, we need to compete on actual educational outcomes. Instead of convincing communities to accept less, we need to demonstrate what's possible when education is properly funded and professionally managed. Thomas Wu, a former university president who brought academic credibility to the board, nodded thoughtfully. Victoria makes a valid point about market differentiation. The question is whether there's sufficient demand for premium educational services to justify the increased costs. Most of our contracts are with economically disadvantaged districts that chose us specifically because we offered lower costs than traditional public education. Those districts chose us because they had no other options, Victoria replied. Their public schools were systematically defunded, their teachers were demoralized and underpaid, their facilities were crumbling. We didn't compete against excellence. We competed against desperation. That's not a sustainable business model, and it's not a legacy any of us should be proud of. The conversation continued for another 2 hours, with board members raising detailed questions about implementation timelines, financial projections, legal implications, and competitive risks. Victoria answered each concern with data and analysis, but she could sense that facts and figures alone would not be enough to convince people who had built their careers on a fundamentally different philosophy of education. As the meeting concluded without a resolution, Robert Thornfield stood and straightened his tie with the deliberate precision of a man preparing for battle. Victoria, I want you to understand something very clearly. This board has tremendous respect for your leadership and your business acumen. But we also have a fiduciary responsibility that we cannot and will not abandon. I'm calling for a special board meeting next month to vote on your proposal. I'm also recommending that we engage external consultants to provide independent analysis of the financial and strategic implications of your suggested changes. Victoria nodded, understanding the subtext of his words. The external consultants would almost certainly be chosen for their likelihood to oppose her proposal. The special meeting would be designed to create a formal record of board opposition to her plans. If she insisted on proceeding, they would have grounds to question her competence and potentially remove her from her position. I understand your concerns, Robert, Victoria said calmly. I look forward to the independent analysis. I'm confident that objective examination will support the wisdom of adapting our business model to better serve our students and communities. After the board members filed out, Victoria remained alone in the conference room, staring out at the city skyline through floor-to-ceiling windows. Somewhere in those buildings were the schools that GED operated, the students who depended on them for their education, the teachers who worked within constraints that prioritized efficiency over excellence. The weight of responsibility felt heavier than ever. Her assistant, Patricia Huang, entered quietly with a stack of documents requiring her signature. Patricia had worked for Victoria for 5 years, had witnessed the gradual transformation from corporate executive to educational advocate, and had become one of the few people Victoria trusted completely. "How did it go?" Patricia asked, though Victoria's expression had already provided the answer. "About as well as expected," Victoria replied with a rueful smile. "They think I've lost my mind." "Have you?" Patricia asked with the directness that Victoria had come to value. Victoria considered the question seriously. "Maybe. Or maybe I've finally found it." She turned from the window to face her assistant. "Patricia, I need you to prepare detailed implementation plans for the new educational model. I want comprehensive budgets, staffing projections, curriculum guidelines, and performance metrics. I want everything ready to move forward regardless of what the board decides." Patricia nodded, making notes on her tablet. "Are you planning to proceed without board approval?" "I'm planning to be prepared for whatever happens," Victoria said carefully. "If the board supports the changes, we'll be ready to implement them immediately. If they don't—" She paused, considering the implications of defying her own board of directors. "Then we'll explore other options." Meanwhile, across the city in a very different kind of educational setting, Marcus Rivera was discovering his own challenges and adapting to his new role as Director of Educational Innovation. The GED headquarters building represented everything he had once despised about corporate involvement in education. But he had accepted Victoria's offer because he believed in the possibility of change and because he needed stable employment to support not just himself, but the ongoing needs of his former students. His office on the 38th floor was larger than any classroom he had ever taught in, with modern furniture, state-of-the-art technology, and a view of the city that reminded him daily of how far he had traveled from the subway underpass. But comfort and prestige felt hollow when compared to the immediate satisfaction of seeing a struggling student finally grasp a difficult concept. Marcus had spent his first month at GED visiting schools, observing classrooms, and interviewing teachers and administrators about their experiences with the company's educational policies. What he found was a system designed for efficiency rather than effectiveness, where standardized curricula left little room for creativity or adaptation to individual student needs. At Roosevelt Elementary, a GED-operated school in one of the city's most economically disadvantaged neighborhoods, he observed a third-grade mathematics lesson that perfectly illustrated the problems with the current approach. The teacher, Mrs. Angela Foster, was working through a scripted lesson plan that required her to cover specific material at a predetermined pace, regardless of whether students were ready to move forward. Marcus watched as several children struggled with basic addition concepts while others had already mastered the material and were becoming restless with boredom. Mrs. Foster was clearly a caring and competent educator, but the rigid curriculum requirements prevented her from addressing individual learning needs. After the lesson, Marcus asked to speak with Mrs. Foster privately. They sat in her small classroom during lunch break, surrounded by colorful posters and student artwork that reflected her genuine love for teaching, despite the constraints she faced. "How long have you been teaching?" Marcus asked. 15 years, Mrs. Foster replied wearily. 7 here at Roosevelt, 8 before that in the public system before the school was closed and reopened under GED management. What's the biggest difference between teaching here and teaching in the public system? Mrs. Foster was quiet for a moment, clearly weighing her words carefully. In the public system, I had more freedom to adapt my teaching to what my students needed. The curriculum was a guide, not a script. If my kids needed extra time on fractions, I could slow down and give them that time. If they were ready to move ahead in reading, I could challenge them. Here, everything is predetermined. I have to be on page 47 of the math workbook by October 15th, regardless of whether my students understand pages 1 through 46. Marcus nodded, recognizing the frustration in her voice. What would you change if you could? I'd go back to teaching like a teacher, instead of like a robot reading from a script, Mrs. Foster said with unexpected passion. These kids are smart and creative and curious, but the curriculum treats them like they're all identical machines that learn at the same pace in the same way. It's not fair to them, and it's not fair to us as professionals. The conversation with Mrs. Foster was repeated in dozens of other schools across the GED network. Teachers felt constrained by policies that prioritized measurable outcomes over meaningful learning. Students were disengaged because lessons were designed for hypothetical average learners rather than the actual children sitting in the classrooms. Administrators were caught between corporate requirements and educational best practices. Marcus documented his findings in detailed reports that he submitted to Victoria weekly. Each report painted a picture of an educational system that was functioning adequately by corporate standards, but failing dramatically by pedagogical measures. Test scores met minimum requirements, but students weren't developing critical thinking skills. Teacher retention rates satisfied contract obligations, but educator morale was dangerously low. Parent satisfaction surveys showed acceptable numbers, but community engagement was minimal. The most troubling discovery came during his visit to Lincoln Middle School, where he encountered a situation that reminded him uncomfortably of his own experience at Riverside High. The school's principal, Dr. Maria Santos, had been struggling with budget constraints that forced her to choose between maintaining small class sizes and keeping experienced teachers. "The corporate office gives us a fixed budget based on enrollment numbers," Dr. Santos explained as they walked through hallways filled with students changing classes. "They don't account for the fact that our students need more individual attention than the suburban schools. 60% of our kids qualify for free lunch. 30% are English language learners. 20% have documented learning disabilities. But we get the same per-pupil funding as schools that serve much less challenging populations." Marcus recognized the impossible mathematics of educational equity. Schools serving the most disadvantaged students needed the most resources, but consistently received the least support. Corporate efficiency models that worked for manufacturing or retail were devastating when applied to education because they failed to account for the complex variables that affected learning. "What would you need to actually serve your students effectively?" Marcus asked. Dr. Santos laughed bitterly. "Smaller class sizes, more counselors, better technology, extended learning time, family support services, professional development for teachers, updated textbooks, and about 3 times our current budget. In other words, everything we don't have." The visit to Lincoln Middle School crystallized Marcus's understanding of the systemic changes that would be necessary to transform GED from a profit-maximizing corporation into an educational enterprise focused on student success. It wasn't enough to adjust policies or increase spending in targeted areas. The entire business model needed to be reimagined around educational outcomes rather than financial returns. That evening, Marcus returned to his apartment, a modest one-bedroom unit that felt luxurious compared to his years of homelessness but strange, after decades of dedicating his living space to student needs. He had been writing detailed recommendations for Victoria, but tonight he decided to try a different approach. Instead of focusing on policy changes and budget adjustments, Marcus wrote about individual students. He described Jerome's struggle with reading comprehension and the specialized support that had helped him succeed. He wrote about Maya's scientific curiosity and the laboratory experiences that had transformed her understanding of chemistry. He detailed Carmen's determination to complete her education despite teenage parenthood and the flexible scheduling that had made her graduation possible. Each story illustrated principles of effective education that went far beyond standardized curricula and efficiency metrics. Real learning happened when teachers understood their students as individuals, when schools provided comprehensive support for families facing economic challenges, when curricula connected abstract concepts to students, lived experiences, and future aspirations. As Marcus wrote, he thought about the evening sessions in the subway underpass that had brought him together with Victoria and Sofia. Those informal lessons had been more educationally effective than many formal classrooms because they had been driven by genuine relationships, authentic curiosity, and shared commitment to learning. The challenge was scaling that kind of personal engagement across an entire corporate network, serving hundreds of thousands of students. The next morning brought news that would complicate everything. Patricia Huang called Marcus with an urgent request to attend an emergency meeting in Victoria's office. When he arrived, he found Victoria pacing behind her desk with an expression of barely controlled fury. The board hired educational consulting associates to conduct an independent analysis of our proposed changes, Victoria said without preamble. ECA is run by Richard Brennan, former CEO of Academic Excellence Corporation and one of the most vocal opponents of increased education spending in the industry. Their report is due next week, 2 days before the board vote. Marcus understood the implications immediately. Educational consulting associates had built their reputation by providing analyses that supported cost reduction and efficiency maximization in educational settings. Richard Brennan had personally overseen the closure of dozens of schools and the elimination of thousands of teaching positions during his tenure at Academic Excellence Corporation. "What's our response?" Marcus asked. "We're going to present our own analysis," Victoria said, her voice regaining its characteristic determination. "We're going to document every aspect of our current operations and demonstrate exactly why the status quo is unsustainable. We're going to show them data they can't dismiss or ignore." Over the next week, Marcus and Victoria worked 18-hour days to prepare a comprehensive presentation that would counter whatever ECA's report contained. They compiled test score data, teacher satisfaction surveys, parent feedback forms, student attendance records, and community engagement metrics from every school in the GED network. The data painted a sobering picture. While GED schools met minimum state requirements and performed adequately on standardized assessments, they lagged behind national averages in almost every measure of educational quality. Teacher turnover rates were nearly double the national average. Student engagement scores were consistently below the 50th percentile. Parent satisfaction ratings, while acceptable, showed declining trends in most districts. More troubling were the long-term outcomes for GED graduates. College enrollment rates were lower than those of comparable public schools. Career readiness indicators suggested that students were graduating without the critical thinking and problem-solving skills necessary for success in modern workplaces. Alumni surveys revealed that many former students felt unprepared for the demands of higher education or professional employment. "The current model is failing our students," Victoria said as they reviewed the final presentation slides. "We're not just providing inferior education. We're limiting their life opportunities." Marcus nodded grimly. "The question is whether the board will care about long-term student outcomes when the short-term financial returns are meeting their expectations." The question would be answered sooner than either of them anticipated. The following Monday, Robert Thornfield called an impromptu board meeting to review both the ECA report and Victoria's counter-presentation. The atmosphere in the boardroom was even more tense than the previous month's meeting, with board members clearly divided into opposing camps. Richard Brennan attended the meeting as a special consultant, his presence lending authority to ECA's findings. He was a thin, sharp-featured man in his 60s, who spoke with the confident precision of someone accustomed to being the smartest person in the room. His presentation was polished, data-driven, and devastating in its critique of Victoria's proposals. "Ladies and gentlemen," Brennan began, "I've spent 4 decades in educational management, and I can tell you with absolute certainty that the proposals presented by Ms. Castellanos Chen would be disastrous for this company and the students it serves." Brennan's presentation methodically dismantled every aspect of Victoria's plan. Increased teacher salaries would drain resources without measurable improvements in student outcomes. Smaller class sizes would reduce efficiency without evidence of educational benefits. Enhanced support services would create dependency rather than self-reliance among struggling students. "The fundamental flaw in Ms. Castellanos Chen's approach," Brennan concluded, "is the assumption that spending more money automatically produces better results. Decades of educational research demonstrate that resources matter far less than accountability, structure, and clear expectations. The current GED model provides exactly the kind of focused, efficient education that these communities need." When Brennan finished, the room was quiet, except for the soft sound of board members taking notes and exchanging glances. Victoria felt the weight of their skepticism pressing down on her like a physical force. Everything she had worked for over the past year was hanging in the balance. "Thank you, Mr. Brennan," Victoria said, standing to begin her own presentation. "I appreciate your analysis, and I understand your concerns about fiscal responsibility. But I'd like to share some additional data that I think provides important context for our discussion." Victoria's presentation began with the same financial projections that Brennan had criticized, but then shifted to information that he had not addressed. She showed longitudinal data tracking GED graduates over 5- and 10-year periods, comparing their outcomes to those of students from higher-funded school systems. The results were stark. GED graduates were significantly less likely to complete college degrees, more likely to require remedial education, and less successful in securing stable, well-paying employment. The short-term savings achieved through efficiency measures were creating long-term costs for both individuals and society. Mr. Brennan is correct that increased spending doesn't automatically improve outcomes, Victoria acknowledged. But strategic investment in proven educational practices does produce measurable results. The question isn't whether we can afford to implement these changes. The question is whether we can afford not to implement them. Victoria clicked to a slide showing comparative data from 3 pilot schools that had been implementing elements of the new model for 6 months. Test scores had improved across all demographic groups. Teacher retention had increased dramatically. Parent engagement had reached levels not seen since the schools had been under public management. These results weren't achieved by spending money randomly, Victoria explained. They were achieved by investing in the specific factors that educational research has consistently identified as drivers of student success: qualified teachers, reasonable class sizes, comprehensive support services, and curricula that engage students' interests and abilities. Margaret Chen raised her hand. Victoria, these pilot programs have been operating for only 6 months. How can you be certain that the improvements are sustainable over longer periods? That's a fair question, Margaret, Victoria replied. But I'd ask you to consider the alternative. Our current model has been operating for 8 years, and the long-term data shows declining outcomes for our students. How long should we continue an approach that we know isn't working while we wait for perfect certainty about alternatives that show promise? The presentation continued for another hour, with Victoria addressing each of the concerns raised in Brennan's report. She provided detailed implementation timelines, risk management strategies, and contingency plans for various scenarios. She acknowledged the financial challenges while demonstrating that the proposed changes were economically viable if implemented strategically over a 3-year period. When she finished, the room was silent for a long moment. Robert Thornfield was the first to speak, his voice carefully neutral. "Victoria, I want to thank you for a very thorough presentation. You've obviously put considerable thought into these proposals, and I respect your commitment to improving educational outcomes for our students." Victoria sensed a but coming and braced herself for what would follow. "But," Thornfield continued, "I remain concerned about the financial risks and competitive implications of making such dramatic changes to our business model. I think we need to proceed very carefully, with extensive additional analysis and gradual implementation." Sarah Mitchell leaned forward. "Robert, with respect, how much additional analysis do we need? Victoria has provided comprehensive data showing that our current approach is producing inferior long-term outcomes for students. At what point does continued analysis become an excuse for avoiding necessary action?" The question sparked a heated discussion among board members, with opinions divided roughly along generational lines. Younger members were more supportive of Victoria's proposals, while older members favored maintaining the status quo. The debate continued for another 2 hours, covering ground that had been thoroughly explored in previous meetings. Finally, Thomas Wu called for order. "I think we've heard enough discussion for today. I'd like to propose that we schedule a formal vote for next week, giving everyone time to review all the materials and come to a decision." Robert Thornfield nodded. "I agree. This is too important a decision to rush. I'm calling for a formal board vote 1 week from today on Ms. Castellanos Chen's proposal to restructure our educational model." As the meeting concluded, Victoria felt a mixture of relief and apprehension. She had presented her case as effectively as possible, but she knew that the vote would be close. Everything she had worked for over the past year would be decided by 12 people whose primary allegiance was to financial returns rather than educational outcomes. That evening, as Victoria sat in her penthouse apartment reviewing the day's events, Sofia joined her on the terrace overlooking the city lights. At 17, Sofia had grown into a thoughtful young woman whose experiences on the streets had given her insights into social justice that most people her age never developed. "How did the meeting go?" Sofia asked, settling into the chair beside her aunt. "As well as could be expected," Victoria replied. "The vote is next week." Sofia was quiet for a moment, looking out at the sprawling cityscape below them. "What happens if they vote against you?" Victoria had been avoiding that question, but Sofia's directness forced her to confront the possibility of failure. "Then I'll have to decide whether to accept their decision or find another way to pursue these changes." "And if you find another way?" "Then I'll probably lose my job, my position, and most of my wealth," Victoria said with surprising calm. but I'll keep my integrity and my sense of purpose." Sofia smiled. "That sounds like something Mr. Marcus would say." Victoria laughed. "I suppose it does. He's been a good influence on both of us." As they sat together in comfortable silence, Victoria thought about the journey that had brought her to this moment. A year ago, she had been a successful corporate executive, focused entirely on profit maximization and competitive advantage. Tonight, she was preparing to risk everything she had built to pursue an ideal that might be impossible to achieve. The transformation had begun with Sofia's disappearance, had deepened through her experiences teaching in the subway underpass, and had crystallized through her growing understanding of how corporate policies affected real students in real classrooms. There was no going back to the person she had been, regardless of what the board decided. The city lights stretched endlessly in all directions, each one representing families and communities whose children deserved access to excellent education. Somewhere in those lights were the schools that GED operated, the teachers who worked within its constraints, the students whose futures hung in the balance. Next week's vote would determine whether those students would continue receiving education designed for corporate efficiency or begin experiencing education designed for human flourishing. For Victoria, there was no longer any question about which outcome was worth fighting for, regardless of the personal cost. The boardroom fell silent as Robert Thornfield announced the final tally: 7 votes against, 5 votes in favor. Victoria's proposal to transform global educational dynamics had failed by the narrowest possible margin. The decision hung in the air like smoke, thick with implications that would reshape everything. Victoria stood slowly, her hands steady despite the earthquake occurring inside her chest. She had prepared for this moment, had known it was likely, but the reality still struck her with unexpected force. 8 years of building the company, countless hours of strategic planning, millions of dollars in personal investment, all reduced to 12 people raising their hands in a sterile conference room. "Thank you all for your consideration," Victoria said, her voice carrying none of the defeat she felt. "I understand your concerns and respect your decision. However, I cannot in good conscience continue leading a company whose educational philosophy I fundamentally disagree with. Effective immediately, I'm resigning as CEO of Global Educational Dynamics." The announcement sent shockwaves through the room. Board members who had voted against her proposal suddenly looked uncertain, as if they hadn't considered the possibility that Victoria would choose principles over position. Robert Thornfield's face paled as he realized the implications of losing the architect of GED's success. "Victoria, let's not be hasty," Thornfield said quickly. "Perhaps we can find a compromise, a gradual implementation of some of your ideas." But Victoria was already gathering her materials, her decision crystallized by months of moral clarity. "There's no compromise between excellence and exploitation, Robert. These children deserve better than what we've been providing, and I won't be part of a system that treats their futures as acceptable casualties of corporate profit." Within hours, news of Victoria's resignation had spread throughout the education industry. Stock prices plummeted as investors panicked about GED's future without its visionary leader. Competitors scrambled to poach key employees and contracts. Media outlets ran stories speculating about the reasons behind the sudden departure of one of private education's most successful executives. But Victoria wasn't paying attention to the corporate chaos she had left behind. Instead, she was in her car, driving toward the Roosevelt Elementary School, where Marcus had introduced her to Mrs. Angela Foster months earlier. If she was going to start over, she wanted to begin where the real work of education happened, in classrooms with teachers who had never lost sight of their mission despite corporate constraints. Mrs. Foster was surprised to see the former CEO of her school's management company standing in her classroom doorway, but she invited Victoria in with the grace of someone accustomed to unexpected visitors. The afternoon sun streamed through windows decorated with student artwork, casting colorful shadows across desks arranged in collaborative clusters rather than rigid rows. "I heard about your resignation on the news," Mrs. Foster said carefully. "The reporters are calling it shocking and unprecedented." Victoria smiled ruefully. "The only shocking thing is that it took me so long to remember why I went into education in the first place." She looked around the classroom, noting the creative learning centers that Mrs. Foster had created despite budget constraints and curriculum requirements. "I came to ask you a question. If you could design a school from scratch, without corporate policies or bureaucratic restrictions, what would it look like?" Mrs. Foster's eyes lit up with the enthusiasm of someone who had been waiting years for that exact question. For the next hour, she described her vision of education centered on student needs rather than administrative convenience. Small classes where teachers could know each child personally. Flexible curricula that adapted to different learning styles and interests. Comprehensive support services that addressed not just academic needs but social and emotional development. Community partnerships that connected classroom learning to real-world applications. "It sounds like you're describing the school I want to build," Victoria said when Mrs. Foster finished. "Would you be interested in helping me create it?" The question hung between them like a bridge spanning two very different worlds. Mrs. Foster had spent years working within systems that frustrated her professional judgment and limited her effectiveness. The opportunity to help design something better was both thrilling and terrifying. "What about funding?" Mrs. Foster asked practically. "What about authorization and oversight?" Victoria had been considering these questions since the moment she walked out of the GED boardroom. "I have enough personal resources to start small. One school, maybe two, serving the communities that need excellent education most. As for authorization, there are pathways for innovative educational models if you're willing to navigate the bureaucracy." Meanwhile, Marcus was experiencing his own crisis of purpose. Victoria's resignation had left him in an impossible position as Director of Educational Innovation for a company that had just voted against educational innovation. Robert Thornfield had called him that morning, offering to maintain his position and salary if he would help implement a more realistic approach to school improvement. But Marcus couldn't forget the conversation he'd had with Dr. Maria Santos at Lincoln Middle School. Couldn't ignore the data showing how GED's efficiency-focused model was failing the students it claimed to serve. When Victoria called him that evening with her proposal to start an independent school, his answer was immediate and emphatic. "When do we start?" he asked. The next 18 months became a whirlwind of planning, fundraising, and construction. Victoria invested her personal savings into purchasing and renovating a former community center in the heart of the district, where she had first taught Sofia and the other children. Marcus developed innovative curricula that integrated academic rigor with practical applications and social-emotional learning. Mrs. Foster recruited teachers who shared their vision of education as a transformative force, rather than a standardized service. Sofia, now a freshman at a prestigious university, spent her summer breaks working at the school they named the Community Learning Collaborative. She coordinated after-school programs, helped design peer mentoring systems, and served as a bridge between the school's idealistic vision and the practical realities of serving students from challenging backgrounds. The first year was harder than any of them had anticipated. Enrollment was limited to 60 students across grades K-8, but those 60 children brought complex needs that required constant creativity and adaptation. Funding was tight, requiring everyone to work for less than they could earn elsewhere. Skeptics questioned whether a single school could prove anything meaningful about educational reform. But slowly, the data began telling a different story. Test scores exceeded district averages within 6 months. Attendance rates approached perfect. Parent engagement reached levels that amazed veteran educators. Most importantly, students began displaying the kind of intellectual curiosity and creative confidence that standardized systems rarely fostered. Jerome, now 16 and preparing for college, served as a volunteer tutor, helping younger students with reading comprehension while pursuing his own studies in special education. Maya had earned a full scholarship to study environmental science, but she returned every summer to teach science camps that inspired a new generation of young researchers. Carmen had completed her nursing degree and frequently spoke to students about pursuing their dreams despite obstacles. The success of the Community Learning Collaborative began attracting attention from education researchers, policymakers, and other reform-minded educators. Delegations visited from other cities, eager to understand how a small school was achieving results that larger, better-funded institutions struggled to match. Victoria found herself speaking at conferences again, but now her message was fundamentally different from her corporate presentations. Instead of talking about efficiency and scalability, she spoke about relationships and relevance. Instead of emphasizing standardized outcomes, she highlighted individual growth and community engagement. Education isn't a business, she would tell audiences of superintendents and principals. It's a calling. It's a commitment to seeing potential in every child and providing whatever support is necessary to help that potential flourish. You can't optimize human development like a manufacturing process. You can only create conditions where growth naturally occurs. The transformation of GED under new leadership provided a sobering counterpoint to the collaborative's success. Without Victoria's vision and expertise, the company struggled with operational challenges and public relations disasters. Teacher turnover accelerated as working conditions deteriorated. Parent complaints multiplied as educational quality declined. Several major contracts were canceled by districts seeking better alternatives. Robert Thornfield, now serving as interim CEO, found himself implementing many of the reforms he had opposed when Victoria proposed them. But the changes came too late and were too superficial to address the fundamental problems with treating education as a profit-maximizing enterprise. As the Community Learning Collaborative completed its third year of operation, Victoria and Marcus stood together in the renovated gymnasium where they held graduation ceremonies for their 8th grade students. 32 young people were preparing to transition to high schools throughout the city, carrying with them not just academic knowledge but confidence, curiosity, and commitment to their communities. Sofia, now a junior studying education policy, delivered the keynote address to the graduating class. She spoke about the journey that had brought them all together, about the power of education to transform lives and communities, about the responsibility that came with privilege and opportunity. 3 years ago, this building was empty, Sofia told the audience of students, families, and community members. Today, it's full of hope and possibility. You've proven that excellence is possible when we commit to serving every child with the resources and support they need to succeed. In the audience, Victoria felt a peace she hadn't experienced since her corporate days. The Community Learning Collaborative wasn't changing the world overnight, wasn't serving millions of students, wasn't generating impressive financial returns. But it was proving that education could be both excellent and equitable when guided by the right values and supported by adequate resources. Marcus looked out at the young faces, preparing to leave their small school for the larger world beyond its walls. Some would face challenges that would test everything they had learned. Others would find opportunities to use their education in service of others. All carried with them the understanding that learning was a lifelong journey and that education was most powerful when it was shared. The subway underpass where everything had begun was now just a memory, but its lessons lived on in the Community Learning Collaborative and in the hundreds of other schools that were beginning to adopt similar approaches to education. Change was happening slowly, one school and one student at a time, but it was happening. As families gathered for pictures and celebrations, Victoria thought about the choice she had made 3 years earlier to resign from GED rather than compromise her principles. The decision had cost her wealth and status, but it had returned something more valuable, the ability to sleep peacefully knowing that her work was making the world better rather than perpetuating its inequities. The evening ended with students, families, and teachers sharing food and stories in the school's community garden, a space that had been created by students studying botany and nutrition. Children who had started as struggling readers were now tutoring younger students. Families who had felt powerless in their children's education were now active partners in school governance. Teachers who had been demoralized by corporate constraints were rediscovering their passion for their profession. It wasn't the ending anyone would have predicted when Marcus first held up his cardboard sign in the subway underpass, but it was an ending that honored the best possibilities of education, while acknowledging the hard work required to transform ideals into reality. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.